Hi, everybody. Welcome to session 4. We are going to be talking with Michael Mazourek during this session, keynote speaker for today's panel. Just to introduce him briefly and then kick it off to him to speak. Michael is a vegetable breeder that serves grower needs for improving disease and insect resistance, as well as flavor in agroecologically based production systems. He's an associate professor at Cornell University, and he's a breeder and co-founder with Row 7 Seed Company. Thanks, Michael.
Okay. Thank you. It's a pleasure to talk to you all today virtually. And what I'm going to talk about is the potential to flip things a little bit. There's all the change we want to make in the world with the food system through agriculture, which has an enormous impact on how we use resources on our planet and also how we take care of ourselves. And one of the key messages through what I'll share is looking at, of all those changes we want to make, how flavor can be the door through which we can enter to be able to tackle many of those questions. So I'll have some images we'll share, and then end a little bit early. If there's any questions, we can be glad to answer. So I'll just work on connecting to the presentation. So as they said in the introduction, co-founder of Row 7 Seeds. And what makes Row 7 Seeds special is, as I mentioned, it's the first seed company built on chefs and breeders and really formed around flavor. Many of us are familiar with the great things that happen through the farm to table movement, how connecting chefs to farms has helped to add visibility, added to the narrative, added to the identity and the importance of things that we know need to happen on farms to make those systems and people that are having practices we want to see more widespread to be celebrated and identified, so we can seek out those people doing those practices. On the plant breeding side, we've started to work on participatory plant breeding. So the idea of connecting the farmer to the plant breeder that can make them the seeds to excel and thrive on their farms. And in that, in a lot of the conversation, the two of the ends that we're not speaking to each other, the creative ends, the plant breeder and the chef. And so Row 7 is really formed around what is the potential we can do working with all those other partners, but really ensuring the chef and the plant breeder have a chance to work together, to talk together, to look at what we're trying to do, what we're trying to share, and how we can use that to hopefully create more change for the food system. So in plant breeding, the first step is quite simple, or deceptively simple. Here is a picture of a pollination. So just pollen from one flower being applied to pollen of another flower that will go on to set seeds. It's a combination of the traits of those two. And in that, even though it can be that simple, and bees do that every day somewhere in the world, one of the big potentials is choosing, well, what to cross together. Who are you going to develop something for? What should it look like? What are the flavors and the size, the earliness? What are the sustainability considerations? What's the audience? How are people going to afford this? And can it really thrive in an organic system and outside of a conventional system? Many decisions are being executed at this moment. And so while it looks picturesque, it's also putting a lot in motion. And in terms of what we put in motion through plant breeding, the conversation, as I said, was kind of limited. As a plant breeder, there's things I saw with flavor. There's crops that I was creating that no one had seen before, maybe wouldn't be seen again. And we are making decisions. And the more people that can be part of the decision-making process, the better, the more chance there is to actually get people what they want, what they need. So the first conversation that really showed me how much was there, maybe how much we were missing, was this dual epiphany moment with myself and the other co-founder of Row 7 Seeds, along with Matthew Goldfarb. But this was a conversation with the chef Dan Barber, who pulled me into the kitchen after I had the good fortune to eat at Blue Hill. And there was a moment when we were talking about plant breeding, what could we do? And he challenged me to shrink butternut squash, to concentrate the flavor. And so you can see the large blonde workaday butternut squash on one side, and the squash that we refined through that conversation on the other side, this honey nut squash. That's the orange, smaller one. And his challenge was, could you concentrate the flavor, make it smaller? I said, well, yeah, of course. And then as I spent some time in the kitchen seeing all the things that everyone was doing in the kitchen, the maximum flavor out of it, the techniques they were applying were different than what we were doing. And so I had the question back. It's like, well, how do we get the most flavor out of what we're trying to do? And it was this dual epiphany where Dan realized he could ask for whatever he wanted. And a plant breeder could probably create something that helped get him there. Whatever he's trying to do in the kitchen, whatever he wanted to express through his cuisine, we could help. And for me, the idea of the technique a chef brings, and not just some of the highest, most refined, most developed, lengthy recipe preparations that can happen. But this goes down to traditional preparations, things that really reflect someone's culture, the recipes of where you came from, the things your grandmothers or great-grandmothers were doing. And how can you create a crop that really speaks to that, or used to exist, but it's been lost? So that process does involve a lot of decision making. So we had a lot of preliminary drafts. So that's a process that created the honey nut squash, which we saw as a spread nationally, and millions of those squash are sold annually now. There's so much more potential to improve upon that. It wasn't great. It wasn't the best it could be. There's a lot for it. But as we looked to create something even better, we had to go through a lot of iterations of all the potential that comes out of one of those cross-pollinations. And so here's one sampling of some of the squash that we worked through, and to decide which ones would work for the farmer, but also importantly, which ones would sing in the kitchen. This is the process that led us to the 898 squash, which is an even more concentrated form of honey nut. So you get all of the best flavors, and you get great storage, which also helps the economic condition of the farmer, but also it even further concentrates the flavor, and you can have it longer into the season. And it's one of my best creations so far. And it was a collaborative creation. Okay. So in the decision-making process, and when you do a pollination and put everything in forward, so you want to think that all the decision-making processes are that open. All the decision-making processes are that inclusive of what you might want, the change you might want to create, and that there's a lot of freedom to be able to make these changes. I wish that were the case. One of the founding reasons to start Row 7 was to help create an alternative model. One of the challenges that is facing the seed industry, which in turn challenges the farmers, which in turn limits the choices of the food you have to grow or to consume, is a massive seed industry consolidation. And in the consolidation, much of the diversity went away. And so what you see in this graphic are the blue dots, which are or were unfortunately seed companies, and then the lines connected them to the companies that purchased those seed companies, and in some cases decided to or not to keep them around, and the growers they were serving, and the areas of the country, of the world they were serving, sometimes no longer had that industry serving them. And you can see part of what you might expect is what's setting the priorities of those new owners of what were seed companies were chemical companies, and that might imply a different set of priorities than an organic, sustainable, ecological food production. So how can we create a system that helps to undo some of this change, all the consolidation and merger that goes to just a restricted set of offerings, a one-size-fits-most approach to agriculture, where most of us don't live in the parts of the world that these companies are primarily serving as some of the major production centers. In the Northeast, we're not one of the major production centers for much of this, what these companies are now creating. They're breeding for Florida, California, a couple other centers in the world of intensified production. What we're left with is something that works for one of those regions that also might fit us. And so when we do this pollination, who do you want to represent? Who do you want to serve? Who's not being currently served? Well, through what we're trying to do is really open it back up and serve a lot of different people, have crops that work in regions that might not be served well, to bring flavors that inspire people to eat, that draw kids in, that bring nutrition with them, not just yield, but to be able to bring nutrition in the yield, but maybe sacrifice conformity, sacrifice uniformity, to create things that are unique, have personality. And important for them being unique is people can then identify them in the marketplace. If they find something they want, they can seek it out if it looks different. And so this is a challenge to a commodity system where otherwise we get very used to these cookie cutter images, shapes, and if you're going to look for a pepper, you might look for a bell pepper, not a habanada. If you're going to look for a beet, you might not look for a Badger flame beet. So it's not just myself as a plant breeder that was challenged. I had many colleagues that are doing creative work, creating flavorful vegetables that people are seeking out, that they want to include in their diets, and no clear bridge, no conversation happening to introduce the produce we'd like to have in the marketplace into the marketplace. So this Badger Flame beet was developed by my colleague Erwin Goldman at Wisconsin-Madison, and his question was, of all the flavors in a beet, what's the one that predominates? Earth, a dirty flavor. That is due to this chemical geosmin. That is what we find responsible for the aroma of soil. And when you smell dirt, you're smelling geosmin. When it rains, like it is now, and you get the earthy smell, that's geosmin. Beets make that compound. So what Erwin asked is, what would happen if we made a beet that didn't make that? And the answer is, it's delicious. One of the barriers to many people liking beets is the earthy aroma. You remove it, you get to taste all the other aspects of a beet, and it's delicious. It looks different, and that's okay. That's part of its value. As I was, again, in the kitchen at Blue Hill looking what they were trying to do and messaging around food waste, one thing that we noticed is that they were working a lot with the stems of the squash in the field. So as a frost comes along, the end of harvest is coming, the beginning of a season before the harvest has started, you have a field full of leaves, stems holding up the leaves. And it turns out that, as people in many parts of the world also know, these are delicious. And so Blue Hill is working to make a gluten-free penne pasta using those stems of the squash. And the challenge that I took up was, well, we could create something that worked much better for that technique. And we end up with a 4-purpose squash for the young fruit, the mature fruit, the stems, seeds, the oils. It serves many purposes. So as we're developing new produce, new products, produce that people aren't used to using, haven't used before, one of the key translators in this is a fantastic group of chefs we work with. So by having a chef to be able to translate, to be able to take a new ingredient, figure out what can you do with it? What are the dishes? How can you use something that people haven't really had in the kitchen before? A new flavor, a new palate, sometimes a crop that's not native to our culture. So having these groups of fantastic chefs co-create, co-select these crops with us, as well as interpret them and try to insert them into our cuisine, and also share the message of what we're doing, often by identifying the cultivar by name on the menu, and often the farmer that grew it. One of those that's currently I'm very excited about. So one of mine is Beauregard, a purple snow pea. It's one of those unintended consequences of crop domestication, where in the process of domesticating pea, we moved mostly to white flower cultivars. And the challenge is, once you have white flowers, you're not making the anthocyanins that give them the purple pigment. You're also losing most of the phenolics, the flavonoids, the compounds that are very healthy for you, and also help the plant communicate the ecology in its environment, defend itself from extremes of weather or pests. So we work to not just put that color back but in the flowers, but also with that color back in the flowers, you can turn on anthocyanin production, antioxidant nutrient production throughout the plant. So this makes a crop that is more robust for a farmer and is delight in the kitchen for a chef. And also, I think is important, is one of those gateway vegetables. I have 2 young kids at home, and I know that if I bring them crops, veggies that are a small size, easy to snack on, colorful, new, they get excited, they eat it, and once that happens, then they're on a trajectory of eating more vegetables, eating the right way, and hopefully for life. Beyond just vegetables, also working with grains, a critical part of the food system, both for the rotations on the farm, in with the vegetables, alternate seasons to break pest and disease cycles, and also looking at how to really select them for optimal flavor and nutrition for people. A lot of grain goes to animal feed. There's a lot of potential to select the grains we eat, as my colleague Kevin Murphy here is doing, for the best flavor, the best nutrition for us as well, and also to work for the grower, no matter where you are. So beyond the kitchen, it's important, if we're going to gain traction, how we change the food system, to not to enjoy what we do in the kitchens, but also get out of the restaurant doors into the streets, to prove that things can scale, and that we can have an impact, and to reach many more people, many more eaters of different type, that seek out different dining experiences. So one of our first forays into this, a partnership with a fast casual lunch company here, Sweetgreen, growing a 250,000 pounds of a new squash creation. This coconut squash is a fusion food, being able, starting though even at the level of the seed in the field, taking the best of the American butternut squash we've been working with, the best of a Japanese tempura, kabocha-like squash, bringing them together. You get the best of both. It looks a little different. It tastes wonderful. And so here is the partnership to look at how can we actually use these, identify them by name, so as people want to seek them out, they can, and just to prove in a very delicious, accessible way that this can be something that everyone can enjoy. And it's also something that isn't just at a small niche scale, but can really start to blow up and make an impact, be at scale in the food system. So you've noticed, as I've talked about some of these vignettes and the crops, some of the things it does. So in terms of being able to let us have these nutritious crops, things that are fit for organic systems that are better. So some of the key things that we do behind the scenes, the messaging, the change we're trying to create, is really looking at the benefits of plant breeding. There's very few silver bullet solutions that work or work beyond a very short term. So we're avoiding the GMO approach because breeding is actually allows you to tackle much more complex problems in a very holistic way. We're breeding for organic systems. Why? Well, if you want to be able to have a sustainable agricultural system to breed and to be able to grow crops in a very ecological way, you need to develop those crops so that you can grow them in those systems. Otherwise, they're always at a disadvantage. So by focusing on organic systems, we're creating the plans that will allow us to have the food system change we want. We need to build capacity for these things, which is going to help as we build scale. Then things become cheaper. There's an efficiency of scale. So how can we expand the capacity in the U.S.? Many of the seeds for the food we grow now are not produced in the U.S. How can we build this domestic capacity with local, regional growers, specialists in these to help them work at a higher scale to make this more accessible to more people? It's also very important that we are making this something that others can build on. That's the history, the legacy of the food system, is that we're always taking something and making it better. And where this something comes from is it was left for us in previous generations. One challenge to most of the food system right now is the idea, the one that I'm the most focused on, is often utility patents. And these are patents beyond just on a plant, but on a trait, a concept, something that might make something more sustainable. You can patent and restrict. By getting our crops, our seeds out in the world, that means they cannot be patented by ourselves or others, and that keeps it free and open for others to work with and improve in generations to come. So although we're a seed company, you'll see a lot of what we're trying to do is to create change. That's the reason behind our slogan. And so what we're doing, we call it a flavor mutiny, to be able to create change in the food system for a more sustainable, just, accessible system through using flavor to be able to drive, to get interest, to be what draws people in, to be able to want to be part of this change. So we invite everyone to join what we're doing.
Thanks so much, Michael. This is awesome. And really, we try to, Matt and I are trying to keep our talking to a minimum, which is why your introduction was so short. But we do think that it's a really interesting way to bring the kitchen back into it, biodiversity back into it, and generally a different perspective than some of the ones that we're hearing here. So we're going to jump straight to the questions that we are getting in the Ask the Question area. One of them is something that you briefly touched upon when you mentioned the GMO aspect and the fact that it's not really GMO. But for the audience, can you clarify the difference between plant breeding and genetic modification, and to what extent that matters? How does that matter?
Yeah, and so there's two extremes on the spectrum of how you would create change in a plant. So increasingly, once you discover a gene and you want to explore its function, and you think they might be able to do something to change the plant, you can isolate the gene from a plant or any other organism. You can even kind of type it into your keyboard, and you can order that sequence delivered to you, the next morning, maybe a week, depending on how much. And so you can just insert a single gene into a plant. You can edit it, you can change it, but so you're working on a one single gene approach. The challenge with that is they seldom work very long. So as you put in a single gene, it's very easy for an organism to evolve. If it's for disease resistance, pest defense, it's very easy to adapt around it. So for like Roundup, you see all these Roundup resistant weeds now. They found ways around that. For BT corn that is resistant to an insect, the insects develop resistance the same way you get antibiotic resistance in a hospital. Just that one pointed solution has challenges. The thing in plant breeding is we work with the whole genome, all the genes. So by just making a cross-pollination, the same as has been done in agriculture since the domestication of plants, the foundations of our civilization, really. So those cross-pollinations that a bee could do it in the garden, we're just doing it with a little bit more intent and foresight, is when you have that cross-pollination, any given plant will have 30, 40,000 genes. And so you're putting all of that into play. And it's all that subtle variation that gives the resilience, the ability to continue to make progress, and much less often comes with the patent that also the GMO comes with. So in plant breeding, it's really cross-pollination, selection then of the progeny through an evolutionary type approach where you're getting plants that are increasingly improved to be better, more fit for the environment. We can continue to improve on it. It's the natural selection process. And the GMO approach is you can have a one gene at a time attempt to do something similar.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another question. These are all really interesting questions. Do you have a favorite?
Yeah. Let's see. Where have we voted up here? Yeah, so I guess the second question that got voted up to the top here is pretty interesting. So Michael, the question is, are these varieties being farmed commercially on large acre blocks? Is there a go-to-market for large-scale production and national distribution and branding? I think that's often a question when it comes to things like this that might seem to have a niche audience, especially when you're talking hand restaurants and chefs. So good question about scalability and distribution.
Yeah, that's a great one. And so, yes, Rachel?
Combine that with another question. One question talks about affordability. So if you could combine scale and affordability question too.
Yeah, and so I think that's the key thing and something to balance, I think, in scaling. So these are varieties that we offer from a small packet of seed that someone could grow on their windowsill, their backyard garden, their fire escape, wherever. So you can just plant a couple of these all the way up to, we sell very large commercial quantities. So it's important that everyone has access to the whole range of scales. As we work at the larger scale, it's one of the things we learned with the Robbins Kogi nut squash that was in its first season, nationally, 500,000 pounds were grown in the first year. And so I think that speaks to the scale we can get. We know that these things can become national in terms of previous work with honey nut squash that is in many grocery stores nationwide, farmers markets. You find it everywhere. As far as affordability, if you look at some of these crops and the example that look at just the honey nut, that's kind of where we were, but it's had more time to kind of spread through the marketplace. Half a squash, and they're quite small, like this big sort of squash, smaller. That has 200% of your provitamin A daily allowance. You'll find people selling the squash for 50 cents a piece. So that means 2 people in the family get all the nutrition, all the beta carotene, everything in that plant-based food without the need to add all the sugars and everything else to it. And their provitamin A for 25 cents a person in the household. So I think we can compete. I think these things can compete very well when given the chance. And so we're working on supporting and creating the opportunity for these things to be given the chance. And then once they scale, it's great. We don't want to scale to the level of, I wouldn't consider a success if someone's growing a 10,000 acre field of any one of these, just because that monoculture in itself isn't sustainable. So we still want to break things up a bit. So that's one aspect to scale that we will stop at probably before some other companies might.
Yeah. think that we'll dig into this a little bit more in the next panel. Again, there are some questions here that are not answered. If during the next panel you feel like answering them written down, that's totally fine. But otherwise, it's just we unfortunately have to move on to the next one. Feel free to chime in with the same questions to the audience in the next panel, where Michael will be coming back in with some extra guests.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
So everyone attending and watching, just hang tight for a minute. We're going to end the broadcast here today. And Michael, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Fantastic presentation content. We're going to keep the conversation going, but everyone just hang tight. We'll pull you into the next session here in about 10 or 15 minutes.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. See you soon.
Michael, see you in a second.
Yep.